Welcome to A Bird's Life, everybody. We're so happy that you're here to join us today for virtual camp. And hopefully, if everything goes as planned, next year we'll be back at Cedar Lakes. And I'd like to introduce you to our very experienced and interesting presenter. His name is Michael Schramm. He is a ranger at Ohio River Islands National Wildlife Refuge, where he is frequently distracted by birds and birdsong. He started out his career as a field geologist working on a ship, but after through hiking the Appalachian Trail, he decided he'd rather work to share the wonders of the natural world. After serving 2 years in the Peace Corps as an environmental educator in Kakistan, he became a backcountry ranger at Grand Canyon National Park. And during 6 years at the park, he started a family and discovered birding, a hobby which indirectly led to an environmental education position at Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge in Olympia, Washington, and now at Ohio River Islands National Wildlife Refuge right here in West Virginia. In addition to birding and hiking, he enjoys messing around on the guitar or piano, contemplating Eastern philosophy, making art, and playing with cats. So please give him a warm welcome and we'll get started.
All right. I could have said almost anything and you would have read it, huh?
Almost.
I should have thought of something even weirder to write.
Well, it's very interesting. I was really interested in the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah, I could give a whole talk just on that. Like, we can switch topics if you want. I like talking about birds. They're great. Should I just go ahead and start?
It's all yours. Take it away.
Okay. So the biography actually was a pretty good summary of my background. I would add, are any of you, I think I can see most of you, are any of you into birds already? Like, if you look at birds outside your windows, do you know what they look like? Just raise your hand if you do. A couple people, that's pretty good. All right. Do you think you kind of can identify some as well? Yeah, okay, good. So it's not like a strictly beginner group, so that's pretty good. So, for my part, I didn't really find birding or get into birding at all until I was about 35 years old. So when I hear people who are into it when they're younger, that's kind of impressive to me. I watched some birds. I saw when I was about 13. There was a mockingbird that had a nest, in a tree outside a window, and I watched the chicks hatch and feed. I watched its behavior while it fed its chicks and everything. So I've always liked nature, but birding came along later. Certainly the way I do it now, so the stuff I'm talking about. I would have been into a presentation like this when I was young, but I'm going to try and make it interesting to someone who's not that into birding. That's kind of my point. So this isn't an advanced academic ornithological, thesis presentation or something. So it's meant to just be an introductory course to give you some pointers on what to look for and what's interesting about birding and stuff like that. So I'm gonna share my other screen and hopefully this will work. I have the power to do that, right? Okay, good. I hope so. All right. Can everyone see the presentation now? Oh, hang on. Now can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, you should see a big bird on your screen right now. So if you don't see a big bird on your screen, holler. Okay, so this is a yellow-rumped warbler, in case you're wondering, but that's not important. So this is just an intro slide, obviously. So Birdwatching 101. This presentation was originally designed for a Boy Scout troop that visited. So it's kind of following the format they wanted, but it's a pretty good format, and I think it's a good way to introduce it. So I just went ahead and decided I'd use that presentation. My slideshow is not moving forward. Okay, there we go. About to panic. All right. So what you're getting into. So this is a slide that I put in because I think when I wasn't a birder, I was already a ranger. And you would think, oh, if he's a ranger, he should be a birder. First of all, let me just say, most rangers are not birders. I find that shocking, actually, especially in the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the agency I work for now. We're all about bird preservation, where we enforce the Endangered Species Act. Like, this is what we do. And at every refuge I've worked at, I'm like the first visitor services ranger they've had who's actually a birder, which blows my mind. I'm like, wow, you'd think that especially the people who are doing education with the public would be into birds, at least be interested in them, But I think one of the big obstacles is that it just seems kind of overwhelming. And there's so many birds out there, right? So before I was a birder, I didn't really know the numbers. I just assumed that there were like thousands of bird species that I would have to learn to become a birder. And actually, it's not that complicated. So I put these numbers up here. There are about 10,000 species in the world. So yes, if you were going to bird everywhere in the world, you would have to know 10,000 species to be an expert. And that would be ridiculous. That would be a lot of species. But when you like whittle it down just to North America, it's only 800 species, which I say only 800, but compared to 10,000, it's a lot less, right? It is. So there was a really good book. If you guys like to read, I can recommend a book for you. This is the book that sort of, you might say, broke the ice for me, made me think, oh, maybe I can warn some birds. There's a book by a guy named Ken Kaufman called Kingbird Highway. He's local. He's here in Ohio, actually. He lives up in Toledo. But he wrote this book called Kingbird Highway about when he was 16 years old. He like hitchhiked all over the country. This is in the late 60s, and he had parents who were very like hippie-ish parents, I think, and they just like let him do this road trip. It's crazy. But he just had his pair of binoculars, he had his little backpack, and he hitchhiked around the country, and he wanted to see how many birds he could see in 1 year, how many bird species he could see in 1 year. And this was before the concept of a big year existed yet. There's a really good movie called A Big Year that you guys can watch too. It's also really fun. But this is something birders do. When people get obsessed with birding, eventually they kind of think, maybe I should do a big year. Maybe I should see how many bird species I can see in a single year. And in North America, if you're sticking with the North American bird list, it's about 800 species that you could potentially see in a year. So Ken Kaufman, when he was 16, hitchhiking around, just hitchhiking, he managed to see over 700 species in a year, which is really impressive. Today, some of these people who see 700 species are like flying constantly. They're spending tens of thousands of dollars on airplane tickets, and they're chasing every rare bird alert that they see, and they still barely hit 700. Ken Kaufman did it kind of by chance, just as he hitchhiked around. Really, really neat story. And it's a good book. It's worth reading. It's really fun. So once you read that book and I saw those numbers, I was like, 800 sounds kind of manageable. And when you get down to a particular state, so like West Virginia or Ohio, you're looking at about 430 species that you could see. But most of those are what we call accidental birds, meaning that they're from someplace else. So for example, you can see a roseate spoonbill in Ohio, maybe once a year in one location. There will be a roseate spoonbill. This is a bird that's native to Florida, or ibises, or some other weird bird that doesn't belong in Ohio. You can still see them sometimes. But if you get to the ones that are actually supposed to be here, it's only about 200 species. So now it's starting to sound a lot more reasonable. And if you do it just in your neighborhood at any given time, so like right now, in the month of June, in your neighborhood, there's probably about 30 to at most 50 species that you can realistically see. That's not that 30 to 50 species. So you think about it, you probably know the names of other kids at your class at school. If you can learn 30 names in a class of students at school, you can learn 30 birds. So it's very manageable. It's not that hard to do. You can totally do it. I guarantee it. And it ended up being a lot easier than I thought, because different bird species actually look really different from one another for the most part. So a great blue heron looks nothing like a bald eagle, and that looks nothing like a sparrow, and that looks nothing like a blue jay. And these are really distinctive birds. So I think it's very manageable. So if you're at all thinking like, oh, I can't learn birds, I assure you, you can learn them. And you can learn them really quickly, actually, if you put your mind to it. So easy. So why bird? So the numbers are there, the bird species are there, but you can learn them, fine. But why learn them? What's the point? Why do people bird? Sometimes birders look a little crazy. When I was just starting out and I went to a wildlife refuge, you see birders with these harnesses, the binoculars on the harnesses. And I thought, oh, that looks so embarrassing. Like, why would they wear those harnesses with those binoculars? And they got a camera, and the camera lens is so big, they need a baby carriage just to push the camera lens around because it weighs like 50 pounds, and they want to get like a picture of a bird with this massive telescope of a camera lens. So yeah, birders are insane. There's no question about it, but it's fun. That's why it's part of it. So birding is fun. So that's my first slide. It's an excuse to get out and see new places. I can't tell you, since I got into birding, there's a website called eBird, and eBird will tell you on a map where all the hotspots are in any given town or city or community. So in your own neighborhood, there might be hotspots. And so if you're traveling or you go on a family vacation or whatever it is, and you kind of want to know where the birds are, you look at that map and you'll go to that birding hotspot. It will be a place that you would never have gone if you weren't a birder. You would never even have thought of going there, but you go there and it ends up being this really neat place. And so one of the cool things about birding is just that it gets you out into new places that you never would have gone otherwise. So that's kind of a nice excuse to get out. So this first picture up on top here, if I had to guess, I'd say that's probably Florida, someplace in Florida. It's not a super, it's not like the Grand Canyon or something. It's not some super famous view. It's just like a dirt road with a little wetland next to it, but it's still a pretty spot. It's still a neat location. So it's worth going to. It's kind of neat. It gets you to these places. It's probably not at a major park or anything, but people go there. It's educational. I know that at your age, you're already learning about stuff all the time anyway, but us old people need excuses to learn things. And so birding is a good excuse to learn things. You can always learn more, right? And it's fun and a bit wacky. So when there's like a rare bird alert, all these people will just flock to this rare bird from 100 miles around. And you end up with a weird site like this where everyone's got their scope and their tripod and their camera, and they're all just like focused on this bird. And you're like, this is completely wacko. Like, people are just crazy. But it's fun. It's fun to see people being crazy sometimes. So birds are important. So there's a lot of things that birds do for us. And when you get into birding, you get tuned into that and you start being more aware of the whole world around us. And I really like that. So they control pests, meaning bugs and rodents. So hawks, raptors, they eat, of course, mice. Owls eat mice, and sometimes things that you might think not of as pests, like rabbits that are kind of cute, but they eat them, but that's just nature. But they also eat bugs, and that's really important. So we have a lot of wood-boring beetles and grubs and things that do a lot of crop damage each year, or forest damage, either one. And birds eat a lot of those bugs. And if there were no birds eating those bugs would get a huge foothold. Sadly, some of these pests are introduced from other parts of the world, and the birds can't keep up with them anyway, but they still help. So for example, here at the Refuge, I'm in Williamstown, West Virginia right now. There's the forest here had a lot of white ash trees. That was like the major tree in our forest right around the Refuge here. And about 10 years ago, a wood-boring beetle called an emerald ash borer came in and basically has wiped out all of those ash trees. There are no ash trees left in Williamstown. They've killed all of them. So that's really sad. But the thing is, were it not for birds, there are a lot of native beetles that would do the same thing. They would just overrun the forest. And the birds do a good job of keeping at least the native ones in check. If not for that, the forest here would constantly be having huge die-offs from bark beetles and invasive pests. So birds do this huge favor for us. You could argue that they have an economic benefit. That's a common thing these days, is to say, well, what's the economic benefit of something? I don't really care about the economic benefit. I figure the birds have a right to live for their own, for their own well-being. But if you have to measure things in terms of economic benefits, there's no question that birds save farmers a lot of money and foresters a lot of money every year. So that's nice. So they help to limit the spread of disease through those beetles and everything. But they're also what's called an indicator species. Have you guys heard that term before? Younger viewers? Indicator species, or the canary in the coal mine. So the canary in the coal mine thing, it's back in the days of coal mining, or old all kinds of mining, really. Miners would carry a canary in a cage down in the coal mine. And if fumes or something were building up in the mine, the canary would succumb to the fumes and die before the miners would. And so if the canary died, all the miners would run out of the mine as quickly as they could. So that's a phrase, it's a metaphor for what they are to all of us here on planet Earth. So indicator species of environment means that if you're looking at a bird and the birds start dying, that might mean that something is wrong, right? So something isn't right. So I'm going to go through that real quick. So what can they indicate? One is overharvesting. So this bird right here is, I think, a great egret. And as you can see in this lower right-hand picture, its feathers make these really nice plumes for hats. And back about 120, 130 years ago, that was the fashion. Women would have these big, crazy hats that were bigger than their own head even, and they had these big feathers flying off of the hats. And so there was a whole industry built around killing birds with really long, pretty feathers. And there was nothing regulating that industry. There was no one saying, no, this is wrong. There was no government agency outlining it. There was no Endangered Species Act. There was no migratory bird treaty. There was nothing in place to protect these birds. But all of the populations of these birds were crashing. So a lot of birds that you think of as common now, like wood ducks, which you see around here a lot in the spring, they were on the brink of extinction 120 years ago. Egrets were on the brink of extinction 120 years ago. Now they're relatively common, and great blue herons as well, because of this hat industry. This problem is what created the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the refuge system. Teddy Roosevelt saw what was going on, and so after some conversations with a crazy guy named John Muir, he decided that he should use his presidential powers to basically take land and protect it without congressional approval, which at the time was considered outrageous, and it is kind of outrageous, but he did it, and it was a good thing because it prevented these species from going extinct. It's a pretty neat idea. So he created the first, I think, roughly 17 national wildlife refuges. There are 560 today, 570 almost, somewhere in there. So it's become a much bigger system, but it's protecting species, which is important. But we are still monitoring bird species, and if they start declining, we know something's going on. So habitat destruction is the big one we see today. This little bird right here is called a least sandpiper. It's a cute little bird, not super flashy or colorful, but cute. It's got yellow legs. There are other shorebirds. This is called a shorebird, these guys that run on sand and mud. And you see them a lot if you go to the beach or something. You'll see them running back and forth as the waves break on the beach. But the ones at the beach are called sanderlings. They look like this, but they have black legs. They have yellow legs. It's a least sandpiper. Some of them have longer bills that are curved. That'll be another species. But if it's a tiny little bird with a straight little beak and yellow legs, it's the least sandpiper. But the thing about these birds, these are incredible birds. They're very small. They weigh almost nothing, and they migrate incredible distances. So we see them here in North America in the spring and fall as they're migrating to their breeding grounds up in either northern Canada or Alaska, up in the Arctic Circle. And then they fly all the way back south again, and they come through again in the fall, and they fly all the way down to South America, sometimes all the way to the very southern tip of South America. And that's actually where they live most of the time. So they're really a South American bird species, bird type. But you just see them passing through. So this bird is flying basically halfway around the world every spring, and then flying back halfway around the world again every fall, just so they can lay their eggs up in Alaska. And they're tiny. Think about all the calories that have to be burned and all the energy that has to be used during that migration. And they only weigh a few ounces. So you can imagine while they're flying, they're going as fast as they can and as far as they can on each leg of their journey. They'll fly 500 miles at a time, but then they have to refuel. They have to eat some food, right? Otherwise, they're going to burn up all their calories and they're going to die. They're not going to make it to reproduce. So they have certain places where they have always traditionally stopped to refuel. They don't just do it anywhere. They do it at very specific estuaries. That's a place where the river meets the ocean. It's called an estuary. They have very specific estuaries they like to stop at. So if something happens to that estuary, let's say that someone decides to turn it into a deep sea port or a garbage dump or a strip mall or whatever they decide to do, a farm field, to drain it, these things happen. And if that estuary goes away, you can actually see it in the bird population. That bird population will crash because those birds suddenly don't have enough energy to make it to the next estuary up the coast, which might be 100 miles away. And so if that happens, if we see a sandpiper population crash, we immediately start looking at all of the places that that bird refuels, and we think, what's going on? Was there an oil spill somewhere? Did someone drain the swamp? What happened? You know, because that will have an effect on those birds. So happily, once this was realized, and it was surprisingly recently, maybe 50 or 100 years ago, there was this treaty created called the Migratory Bird Treaty that people realized that you couldn't just protect the estuaries on the east coast of North America. If you wanted this bird to survive, you had to protect all of the estuaries along its migration. You had to do the ones in Brazil, you had to do the ones in Venezuela, you had to do the ones in Costa Rica and the US and Canada. And so that treaty makes that the laws that protect those international rather than just American. So that's really important. So these are important birds. They've made a huge difference in terms of nature conservation and how we manage wildlife. So habitat destruction is a big one. Another example is something like the burrowing owl. They live on the Great Plains and they used old gopher holes and stuff to make their burrows. And of course, now we have these big farms that plow up the soil. We've got cows running around out there and they collapse the burrows. And so if the burrowing owl population is crashing, we think, okay, where are their local breeding grounds here? We can go there and we might see that they've been all bulldozed or something. So they always indicate a problem if their population is going down. And of course, there's introduced competition. I love my cat. It's a wonderful cat. I keep it inside. It's not meant to be in the outdoors here. A weird thing about my job is that I now look at almost everything as an invasive species, including my cat. So there are plants that are invasive species that don't belong here. If you go down to the river around here, the Ohio River, you'll see all kinds of plants that don't belong here. If you're not a biologist or you're not in my line of work, you probably don't even know which ones belong here and which ones don't. But once you're in my line of work, everything looks evil and looks like an invasive species, and including some animals. So cats are native to North Africa. They do not belong in North America. And so they do huge damage here. And there was a study that came out a year or two, actually about 5 years ago now, that showed that North American bird populations in general, if you take the average of all those 800 species I talked about, bird populations have dropped about 30% since the late 70s, so about 40 years ago. 30%. So 1 out of 3 birds no longer exists in North America that's supposed to be here. So that's alarming. That's in my lifetime. When I was a kid, there were a lot more birds than there are now. That's really sad to think about. And that trend will probably continue. So, when you guys are my age or when you have kids of your own, there might be less birds in the world and less birdsong. And they looked at, in that study, they looked at, okay, why is this happening? Why are the bird populations declining? And they looked at all of the things, all of the culprits that people usually consider. Crashing into buildings is a big one. Windmills are not a big one. So all the hype about, oh, we don't want windmills, we want to burn coal because windmills kill birds, it's nonsense. Windmills do not kill a lot of birds. Windmills kill about 60,000 birds a year. House cats, 60,000 birds might sound like a lot. House cats kill about 3 billion birds per year with a B. 3 billion birds per year, house cats, just in North America. So that is a huge chunk of the bird population being killed by house cats every year. It is by far the leading cause of bird deaths in North America. Much more than buildings, much more than windmills, much more than car collisions or anything else. House cats are the #1 cause of death for birds. So if you like birds, keep your cat indoors. It is the biggest problem. Selectivity. This slide is a little opaque, but I'll tell you what it means. So what this means is that these are ivory-billed woodpeckers in this picture. They don't exist anymore, they're extinct now. The reason they're extinct is because they had a very, very narrow habitat that they lived in. They lived in old growth trees and swamps. So they had this very selective need, this niche that they filled. House sparrows, which come from Europe, you'll see these all over the place if you start looking for them. They're common under tables at restaurants and everything else, outdoor restaurants. They are not very picky. They'll make a nest any place. They'll make it in any little hole or cavity you see. They'll make them in bluebird nest boxes. They'll make them in traffic lights. They'll make them in the eaves of buildings. They'll make them in your car if your car is sitting there too long. But ivory-billed woodpeckers had one place they could make their nests. And that's a huge disadvantage. So ivory woodbilled peckers, if their population is declining, one thing to look at is just what do they need? What is their need? And so if you're in my line of work, you want to know that. You want to say, well, okay, what do I need to protect? If I want to save this bird species, what's the one thing that I need to do to save this bird species? You look at how selective they are about their lifestyle, their food source, their nesting habitat, whatever it is. That's something that you want to look at. So the bottom line, why bird? This is my little thesis statement for the Boy Scouts that were originally attending this talk. Birding shows us the world as it is in its complexity and in its beauty. In every regard, they increase awareness. Therefore, birding equals enlightenment. You'll have to forgive the corny slide. It's from an old 90s movie. All right. So about birds, bird observation. What do you need to know to get into this? If you want to get into birding. So of course, you need to be able to identify the birds. Bird category ID, bird category refers to the type of bird. So if you looked at the bird in this picture, does anyone know what kind of bird this is roughly? Not even specifically, just like what category? Is it a woodpecker? Is it a duck? What is it? Anyone know?
A wren?
Good guess. No, it's not a wren. So wrens will have a long, thin beak, but otherwise it looks pretty similar to a wren. Wrens also usually hold their tail up rather than down. Anyone else have a guess? All right, so it's a type of sparrow. So sparrows are kind of like wrens. They're another bird that you see a lot down on the ground. So sparrows usually have this beak that's a little stubbier and taller. It's designed for cracking seeds open. They have black and brown striped backs, big eye, short legs, short neck. The tail's usually down. So if you see any bird that has basically this shape and characteristics, you know it's a type of sparrow. And that will make it a lot easier to identify it when you're going to a bird guide or something. You have 700 birds in a bird guide, and you're like, where do I begin? You know, you can begin by saying, okay, it's a sparrow. So I'll look in the sparrow section. That'll help. So that's fine. So you need to kind of know the broad categories. The other key thing, repetition. So in other words, if you study a bird on Saturday, and then you don't study birds again until the following Saturday, you're probably going to forget what you learned the previous Saturday. It will be a lot better if you're kind of birding a little bit each day. And so you're repeating it more often. Maybe you're doing it every time you pass a certain window. You just kind of look out the window and see what's on the bird feeder. That will really help with learning the birds. And then my own piece of advice, and I think this is super important, start with what you see and hear the most. So if you're starting to get into birding, don't start by looking up roseate spoonbills that live in Florida. Yes, you might see one in Ohio, but it's not going to be for 5 years. So don't bother learning it yet. Start with the stuff that's on your backyard bird feeder. Chickadees, sparrows, wrens, pigeons and doves, just things that you see every day, woodpeckers. If you learn that, then when something unusual shows up, you'll realize that it's something unusual and you'll look it up and learn it. But the key is to recognize what's what and what's unusual and what's not unusual. So start with what you see in your own backyard and don't worry about the exotic stuff. And then take good notes. When I say take good notes, I don't mean that you need to keep like a journal of birding, although if you want to, that's fine. Some people sketch the birds that they see. If you've got the sketching skills to do that and you want to do that, great. But it takes some time and effort. Some people take really detailed notes, like in a journal almost. That's fine if you want to do that too. But at a minimum, I think it's really helpful when you go places is if you just keep a checklist of what you saw. Like, and a lot of places will have a checklist. You can just grab right off the shelf when you go at the visitor center or whatever. And you can just use that checklist and check off what you see. But if you do that, it will reinforce what you're seeing. And at the end of the day, when you go home, you can look at your checklist. And when you look at the list of birds there, you'll remember the bird that you saw that went with that name. And it will help you remember that name. And it will help you kind of visualize what that bird looked like. So using a checklist is a really good thing to do. Of course, checklists may seem old school, especially to those of you who are younger. So if you have a phone or a smartphone, or your parents do, or a tablet or anything, you can go to a website called ebird.org. There's an app, of course, that you can download, and you can use that app while you're actually birding to log which birds you're seeing. And it's a really neat app. I swear by eBird. I think it's really neat. It's the one that I mentioned that has hotspots and tells you where to go. And it turns it, in a sense, it turns it into a video game. So it's like you're birding, and it organizes your data for you. You can see what you've seen at that hotspot. It says what you've seen in your county. It says what you've seen in your state and other states, what you've seen in your country. It keeps your life list for you, the birds that you've seen. And for each hotspot, it will like show you where you are relative to other birders. It'll show you what other birders have been seeing. It'll show you how many birds you've seen at that hotspot over the course of all your visits to that hotspot. So it makes it kind of fun. It makes it so that you're competing against yourself, you're competing against other birders, but it also teaches you what birds to look for. It shows you what birds other people are seeing at that hotspot. So kind of know what's being seen before you even go. You can look up whatever birds you don't recognize, and that way you're kind of prepared before you go, and you know what to look for before you even go. And then when you see the bird, you'll be like, oh, that's that one that I saw that I looked up, before I even came. That's that, in this case, white-throated sparrow. So this is a white-throated sparrow on the screen right now. It's got a white chin, white throat. It's got this yellow spot in front of the eye, white and black stripes on the head. The yellow spot and the white chin are what really make it a white-throated sparrow. There is something called a white crowned sparrow that has the black and white stripes, so you got to be careful. But if it has the yellow dot and the white chin, it's a white-throated sparrow. All right, moving on. So bird categories, broadly speaking, different bird books have different ways of doing this, but you have your swimming birds like ducks and loons and grebes and geese. So those are all the ones you see when you go to a pond or maybe to the local river. You've got what they call aerialists, so gulls, terns. These are other birds that you would see around water, but they're not in the water, floating on the water, they're flying around above the water. And then you've got long-legged waders like herons and egrets. So you guys probably know your herons and egrets and stuff, ibises. More obscure and what you might not even know exist are these little small-legged waders. They're called rails, sandpipers, plovers, like these little tiny birds that kind of hide in the reeds sometimes. Some of them are really tricky to see. Getting away from water, you've got in the woods things like turkeys and grouse. These are fowl, quail. You have birds of prey like hawks and eagles, vultures, owls. Then you've got your songbirds, what are called passerine birds or perching birds like jays, chickadees, sparrows, warblers, wrens, and non-passerine land birds like doves, hummingbirds, woodpeckers, kingfishers. So these are all your basic categories of birds. And before you learn, 700 species of birds, you just kind of want to learn the broad categories, just kind of know roughly what you're looking at. What would you expect to see on the edge of water? What would you expect to see in the woods? So learning kind of what birds belong in which environment, that's a big part of birding, and I'll get into that again in a second. So field markings, of course, it's helpful to know some of this stuff. Most of it's really obvious: tail, crown, head, nostril. These are words that you know anyway, breast. But if you're trying to describe a bird to someone, and they're like, how do you know it was a kinglet, a ruby-crowned kinglet? You'll say, well, it had 2 white wing bars. It was a little green bird with 2 white wing bars. And they'll be like, okay, well, that's a pretty good definition. So knowing that you want to look for wing bars is helpful. Hello? Someone's talking.
Can someone, whoever's not muted, please mute? Thank you.
I think they muted it. Okay. So just knowing kind of what to look for. So the tricky words on this list that are good to know are undertail coverts. These are the feathers under the tail right here. And that's a really good thing to look at. So when you're getting into birding and you're trying to figure out what to look at, most birders, when they start out, they look at the color. They think, oh, it was a bright red bird. And it's like, okay, that's useful. But there's a number of species that are bright red birds. So what I need to know is like, what color was the beak? What color was the undertail coverts? Did it have wing bars? Those are the key things to look at, actually. And most people, until they're a little more experienced, don't realize that's what they need to be looking at. So try and avoid making like the broad observation and look for some of the details. Look for some of the little things. Does it have a, well, I'll talk about this again in a second. All right, so you need to know the upper tail coverts, undertail coverts. Primaries are these feathers at the end of the wings. So primaries are a really good term to know. Did it have long primaries or short primaries? That can be a definitive thing if you're telling 2 species apart. And knowing the crown markings and eye markings are usually important too. So that's kind of the key points. I don't want to bore you guys in the minutia of birding, but these are all kind of things you want to look at. So bird size, of course. Some bird books use these 4 birds to describe bird size. So they'll say, was it like a goldfinch-sized bird, which is really small? It's a little bigger than a hummingbird. Was it a robin-sized bird? Everyone kind of knows what a robin looks like. They're kind of small, but not super small. Was it a crow-sized bird? So kind of big, but not huge. Or was it like a really big bird, like a bald eagle? So knowing just kind of the first thing you want to look at is it big or small? Then look at the shape. Does it have a long neck or a short neck? Does it have long legs or short legs? Does it have a long tail or a small tail? Does it have a big head or a little head? If you see a bird just in silhouette, you can probably tell a lot about that bird, even if you can't see the color or any other markings, just by looking at the shape of the bird. So a lot of birders just kind of look at the shape right off the bat, and they can already eliminate whole categories of birds just from looking at the shape. And then there's the bill characteristics. So a lot of birds just kind of have like, look at the bill, what shape was the bill, and that is important. So, and you can look at this chart. I'm not asking you to memorize this, but you can see there's a lot of different sizes and shapes of bills. And of course, a woodpecker bill is nothing like, some crazy shorebird bill that's shaped really weird, or a warbler bill or a finch bill. So finch bills are made for cracking nuts. Insect bills are made for like tweezers, like grabbing little worms off of tree branches. Chiseling bills, like woodpeckers have, are of course made for breaking apart wood. So they all are shaped for what they do. So that's a key point. You probably already knew that sort of intuitively, but it's a key point. It helps you figure out what habitat the bird lives in. It helps you figure out what they're eating, all kinds of stuff about the bird. but it also can help you make the identification. So like if you look at these two woodpeckers in this picture, we have both of these here. You'll probably see both of these in your own yard or in your city park or wherever you're at. So this one is called a hairy woodpecker. This one's a downy woodpecker. They have the exact same markings. They both got this white stripe in the middle of the back. They both got these little white spots on the ends of their wings, a black tail. But if you look at the bill, just from the bill size, you can tell which is which. The bill on this bird is about the same length as the length of the head. And the bill on this bird is not even half as long as the length of the head. So that's how you tell these two birds apart. Otherwise, it's really hard. If you're looking through binoculars, you can't really tell the size difference. But in this picture, I've changed the photographs that this is to scale. So a downy woodpecker is about half the size of a hairy woodpecker. These are, if they were side by side, this is what they would look like. But you can't always tell that when you're out walking around. Sometimes you're like, well, is it a small woodpecker or is it little? I can't tell, you know. But the beak size, if you look at that ratio of beak to head length, that'll tell you what bird it is. So the tail shape and body size, these are all hawks that you see around here, and they all look really similar. Hawks are surprisingly challenging to tell apart from each other. So the first thing that hawk people look at is the size and shape of the tail. Is it a long rectangular tail? Or is it kind of a short round tail like this one? You guys feel like you know any hawks? I don't know if you do.
I love seeing them. I think I see red-tailed hawks, but yeah, I don't really know.
How many red-tailed hawks do you see in this picture? I'm going to test you. How many red-tailed hawks are there?
Two.
Two? Two guys. It's actually all of these are red-tailed hawks over in here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red-tailed hawks. So you can tell a little bit by the tail shape, like these broad kind of rounded tail. This one's looks a little longer. The other thing about this, which is not what this slide is about, is they've got these little black wing bars on the front of their wings. Before I was even a birder, the first thing I ever heard from a birder was someone pointing out a hawk, and they're like, you look at these little black stripes on the front of the wings, and if it has that, it's a red-tailed hawk. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So that's called patagial feathers, these little feathers on the very front of the wing. This is called a patagial marking. And if a hawk has a dark patagial marking, it's a red-tailed hawk. That is the best way to identify a red-tailed hawk, hands down. They don't always have a red tail. Sometimes the tail is kind of gray or white or just the same speckled. If it has a red tail, that's a nice marking. But if it doesn't, look for the patagials. And often you can't see the top of the tail anyway. You're looking at it from underneath. And so the black lines in the front of the wings are the key thing to look for. So that's kind of cool.
Do all hawks, are they all dangerous to chickens?
No, they aren't all dangerous to chickens. And actually, and some of these are tiny. It's like this is a kestrel. That's a tiny little thing that you'll see on telephone lines a lot when you're driving down the road. They're not going to go after a chicken. They're just going after little tiny rodents or even grasshoppers. They're kind of a grasshopper eating bird. They like insects more than they like rodents and stuff even. Some of these are bird eaters. So this one here, they don't go after chickens. They go after songbirds. So if you have a bird feeder in your backyard, you might see these guys snatch birds off your bird feeder every now and then. So they eat songbirds. That doesn't mean that people still don't like them. A lot of people like songbirds and they want their songbirds in their backyard. That's why they have a bird feeder. So they still consider these a nuisance, but the hawk is just doing what it's supposed to do. It's fine. I mean, it's supposed to eat birds. So the bigger the hawk, the more likely it would be to go after a bigger animal, like a house cat even, or a chicken. So I mean, eagles and bigger hawks will sometimes get house cats and eat them. So I've back when I was a kid, I used to live next to a state park, and I went around. Sometimes I'd find cat skulls, cat remains in the woods, and sometimes I'd find them with talon markings in the skull, where a hawk or something had grabbed the cat by the neck or the head and killed it. So yeah, they all eat bigger animals, but again, they're just kind of doing what they do. And there's no right or wrong in it. It's just what they do.
Yeah, I love seeing hawks, but we have a few chickens, so it makes me nervous if they're around my house. I don't want them eaten.
Well, yeah, it's understandable. You don't want to feed the hawks, I guess.
I had a question in the chat. Someone asked what the biggest bird is.
The biggest bird. So there's two different ways to measure that. There's weight and there's wingspan. So, and there's, if you mean just locally or versus like in the world. So in the world, it's an ostrich is the biggest bird. Ostriches are huge. There used to be bigger birds than that, but they've largely gone extinct at this point. Since people were around. I mean, things like the dodo, for example, is the famous example. There's other ones too, emus and things. So the ostrich is the biggest species we have right now by weight. Of course, they don't really have wings though, so they don't have a very big wingspan. Here in North America, the largest bird is the California condor. The Andean condor, which lives in South America, is bigger than the California condor. They have a really big wingspan. I believe it's 12 feet. The wingspan is 12 feet. So that's huge. That's like as big as the room I'm in right now. It's a massive bird. But there are some amazing birds. There's something called a harpy eagle that has it's an eagle that has a huge wingspan, and their main food source is actually monkeys. They eat monkeys. So they're big enough that they can like snatch a monkey off of a tree and fly away with it. They're big, big birds. But around here, one of the bigger birds that you can see is a sandhill crane. They're really big. They have a huge wingspan. You don't see them very often, but you do occasionally see them. My phone's going to be ringing for a couple seconds here. Let it go. That should be it. So yeah, there's some really big birds around here. By weight, I don't know what the heaviest bird is around here or what the bulkiest bird is. It's a good question. I've never been asked that before, and I've never thought about it before. But it's got to be something like, I would guess that it would either be a bald eagle or.
Yeah, I was thinking a golden eagle. Aren't they significantly bigger?
Yeah, the golden eagles are bigger. They're not common around here at all. And a golden eagle is a rare bird, accidental. It's an accidental bird in Ohio. So most of the birds that people see here that they identify as golden eagles are actually juvenile bald eagles. So juvenile bald eagles do not have a white head or a white tail. And a lot of people, if you're newer to birding, will think, oh, it's a golden eagle. It doesn't have a white head and white tail. And it's like, no. That just means it's less than 5 years old. So yeah, golden eagle is very uncommon. They're a big bird, very big bird. Yeah. So unfortunately, that's the best answer I can give you right now. I don't know the definitive answer on weight. All right, so let's move on. So scrutinized markings, of course, if you see a bird, and I'm going to try not to go over my time here. So you can look for barring on the chest, look at leg color. So if it's a shorebird, remember I mentioned those birds that are on beaches and stuff, they all look like this. They're all kind of these white and gray speckled birds. And so when you're looking at a shorebird, the first thing you do is you look at the leg color. Are they black or are they yellow? And then you look at the beak shape. And that's pretty much the only way to tell one shorebird apart from another is those two things, the combination of those two things. So shorebirds are really challenging. You can look for a neck ring. This is actually another type of shorebird. It doesn't look that similar. That's a more distinctive one, but they also have one neck ring. There's one that has two neck rings called a killdeer. If it has one neck ring, it's a semi-palmated plover, which is what this is. And you can look at the crown. Does it have a little spiky head? Does it have a round top on its head? These are obvious things to look at. How is it sitting on the tree? Does it have a red breast or a white breast? Does it have an eye ring? Look at the tail tip. Look at the beak color. So there's red birds that have black beaks. There's red birds that have orange beaks. Now, if someone just comes and says, I saw a red bird, the first thing I'm gonna be like, well, what color was the beak? If it has a black beak, it was probably a summer tanager or a scarlet tanager. If it had a big orange beak, it's a cardinal. And I'll often ask, like, where were they standing and other questions too. So there's a lot of issues. It's not just the bird color is the point. There's all these little details. And so when I look at a bird with binoculars, I'm not going down this list deliberately. It happens kind of by accident. I just go through, it's like so fast, I don't even know what I'm doing, but I'm just like assessing the bird. I'm looking at all these little details all at once. And you sort of get the overall impression. You can eliminate whole categories of birds all at once and hone in on exactly what you're seeing. And I also think about habitats. So if someone tells me they saw a bird with a white rump, like a white patch at the base of the tail, the first thing I'm going to ask is, where were you standing? Another phone call. I'll ask where you were standing. If you were standing a forest, I'll know that you were talking about a flicker, which is a type of woodpecker. If you said you were standing in a meadow, then I'll know that you were talking about a harrier, which is a type of hawk. So you don't have to tell me anything else. If you tell me that it had a white spot on its rump, all I have to know beyond that is where you were standing. I'll be able to tell you what bird you saw. So habitat matters. It will matter for a lot of different birds. So it's definitely part of identification. You might not have thought of that as a type of identification. If you still don't know, if you're in the field and you're like, I still don't, I've gone through my little checklists in my brain, I've tried to figure it out, I don't know. Just take some notes, write it down. You can identify it when you get home. But try and look at all those things I just discussed. Note if it had an eye ring. Note the shape of the beak. Note if it had a crest or what the leg color is. Those are all the things you need to look at. And then look in a book. But don't look in the book first. Like if there's a bird in front of you, don't start paging through your book. Just look at all of those things. Try to memorize that bird completely and then start looking through the book. And if the bird is still there, you can double check with the book, but most of the time the bird flies away. So you just got to make a really good mental picture using all those things I was just talking about. So, some people, like I said, take really detailed notes. You don't need to go quite into this kind of detail, but it's the type of stuff you want to be aware of. Really detailed notes, if you want to do, you could do that. I don't do that, that's for sure. That would take forever to write a paragraph like that about a bird, but you could. What were the air temperature? What was the wind speed? What was the weather? Where was I standing? What kind of tree was it in? How high off the ground was it in the tree? That can actually be useful. Some flycatchers, for example, which is just a little gray bird. We have like 5 species of flycatcher, and they're all a little gray bird. They all look identical. So whether they're at the top of a tree or at the bottom of a tree can actually be useful to tell one apart from the other. They have different preferences about where they are in the forest. So sometimes the notes, taking really detailed notes can be helpful, but most of the time it's like, that's a lot of work for some little detail that you might overlook. But a really important thing is also the range. So every bird guide, if you guys haven't looked at a bird guide, take a look at a bird guide. They'll always have these little maps for each species of bird. And if you think that you're seeing a bird, and then you look at the map and that bird isn't in your state, then you obviously didn't see that bird, right? But sometimes it'll be like, for this one is a harrier. You'll have a map like this. You'll have its winter range. You'll have its summer range. We're right at the northern tip of its winter range. So if you were here telling me that you saw a harrier in July, I'd probably question that sighting. If you said you saw it in winter, I'd feel pretty comfortable with that. Now it can be just north of us, it's year round. So it depends on where you're standing. And if you were right here, just a little bit south of us up in the mountains, you would only see them during migration. So you have to take the time of year into account as well as where you're standing. It's the combination of those two things. So that's part of bird identification. So as you'll see, if you go to the sparrow section of a bird guide, you've got like 30 sparrows to choose from. And so just looking at that range map can really narrow down what you're looking at quickly. Like you can eliminate 15 sparrows right off the bat just by looking at the map. And you'll know that those 15 sparrows, as much as that might have looked like the sparrow you were seeing, it's not the sparrow you were seeing, because that sparrow only lives in Texas, or it only lives in California. And it doesn't live in Ohio. So that can be really helpful. So always look at the range map. So that's pretty much everything that I have to say about birds and birding. Any questions? You guys have any thoughts? Anything else you wanted me to talk about?
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or you can type them in the chat. We have about 5 minutes before the session ends. I'll start off with my first question.
All right.
Should we be feeding the birds this time of year from our bird feeders, or should we let them forage on their own?
Okay, that's a good question. So I think some birders or bird enthusiasts, people who have feeders, primarily feed them in winter because the birds need energy, right? It's cold outside, they need the calories to stay warm, and food is scarce. And you don't want birds to freeze to death or starve to death. So they'll put out feeders, and that does help the birds survive winter. That's great. In the summer, I think it's okay to feed birds year round. There are some birds that you don't want in the area, like there's a bird called a brown-headed cowbird, which is a bird that lays its eggs in other bird species' nests. And they're native to the Great Plains, like South Dakota and Montana. They're called cowbirds because they eat the flies off the backs of cows, and they need to follow the bison around. The bison are their natural. The cows I'm talking about are bison in this case. So they used to follow the herds of bison around, and if you're following herds of bison around, you can't really have a nest and raise chicks. So they would lay their birds in another bird's nest. And that wasn't that big a deal on the Great Plains because everything on the Great Plains had sort of evolved together and adapted to that situation. But, it used to be a forest between here and the Mississippi River, and we've now cut down all those trees. And so we essentially turned Indiana and most of Ohio into South Dakota. And now there's all these cowbirds around. And unfortunately, they eat seeds as well as flies. So if you're feeding the cowbirds, that's only encouraging them to be here, and they're laying their eggs in the warbler nests, and now the warbler population is declining because the cowbird chicks kill the warbler chicks. They either outcompete them for food or literally kill them. So the warbler population is crashing because of these cowbirds that we let in here, and the bird feeders maybe are not helping that situation. So some people choose not to feed birds in the summer because of cowbirds, maybe because of starlings or other invasive species. I don't think it's that big a deal. I don't think it's the end of the world. I feed my birds year round. If I have a suet cake, which is a type of bird food, if I see that a lot of starlings or cowbirds are using my suet, I'll take it down. So I just kind of monitor my bird feeders and make a decision based on what I'm seeing out there. If it's native birds, I think it's fine. You're
We have
muted.
a question in the chat that says, what should you do if you see an injured bird while outdoors?
Okay, cool. I should open the chat here. Let me do that. Okay. So yeah, if you see an injured bird outdoors, do not take it to us. Do not take it to the wildlife refuge or your local park. That they will not have the facilities to help a bird anyway. They don't have, I don't have a veterinary facility here. People take injured birds here all the time. But the only place that you can take an injured bird legally is a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. So this is a special license that certain people can get. You don't have to be a veterinarian to do it, interestingly. No veterinarian almost has one. So veterinarians typically do not get those licenses because they don't want people to bring them wildlife. They want to do domestic animals. So don't take it to a vet either. So where you can take it, if, depending on where you are, you can go to the, you can go to our website at Ohio River Islands. We have a list of all the wildlife rehabilitators in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania on our website. Or you can just call the local state wildlife agency. I'm drawing a blank.
West Virginia DNR.
DNR, yes, thank you. If you call West Virginia DNR, they can tell you who the closest wildlife rehabilitator is as well. Sometimes you get someone who's not very experienced and they'll tell you to call us, which annoys me. So, because we're not a wildlife rehabilitator and we're just going to tell you, look at our website and look at the list. But that's the bottom line. You need to take it to a wildlife rehabilitator. There are not many around. They will not come get the wildlife from you. So one catch is that you have to transport the wildlife to the wildlife rehabilitator. That can be tricky. If it's some ferocious little animal with sharp teeth, or if it's a bird that's not happy and it's able to peck and claw at you, that can be really tricky to have that in your car. So it's not always easy, but it can be really worthwhile. The closest wildlife rehabilitator that I recommend for birds is in Morgantown. So you're talking about an 1.5-hour drive just to get there.
How can we deter crows in our area? We probably just have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We got 1 minute.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't deter crows. Crows belong here. So there's nothing wrong with crows, and it's actually illegal to harass wildlife. So it's not legal to deter crows. That's my answer. Next question. See, are whippoorwills still in decline? That's a really good question. So whippoorwills, I think they are in decline, but they're not as uncommon as most people think. If you go to the right place, you can hear whippoorwills around here. And people get really excited when there is one. But I went up in the hills just outside of Marietta about a few weeks ago, and I excited to see one whippoorwill, and I just cupped my ears like this. And if you cup your ears, you become superhuman. You can hear everything within like a few miles. And I was hearing at least a dozen whippoorwills in the hills. You just had to wait until well after sunset. I think most people aren't waiting long enough, but they're out there. There's a lot of whippoorwills around. I think they are still in decline. I don't know how badly or severely they're in decline.
Well, everyone, it's 10 o'clock, so the next session is getting ready to start. And I really want to thank Michael for being here today. It was a very interesting presentation, and I learned lots of new things about birds that I didn't know already, especially about the #1 killer being cats. So that was really interesting. I would have never guessed that. So thanks for being here. And if anybody has more questions for Michael, maybe I'll look over the chat and see maybe if I can answer them. If not, maybe I can email him your questions and get answers for you.
I was gonna say, you can email me here at the Refuge. It's just Michael_Schramm@fws.gov. F as in Frank, W as in wildlife, and S as in service. Fish and Wildlife Service is what it's saying. FWS, Fish and Wildlife Service, fws.gov. So Michael_Schramm. You can email me questions, or you can email the general account for the refuge, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. So thanks for coming, attending this, and for being a good audience. And it was my pleasure being here.
Thanks so much. All right,
No
goodbye,
problem.
everybody.